So today we will start lesson 5. We'll be looking at John the Baptist, the baptism and temptation of Jesus. But before we get into that, we will go back because there's a few things from our last lesson that we weren't able to finish. So we'll pick that up first. Um, but with today, we will complete the first module, module 1, which is really on the background and preliminary events. So I've gone ahead and made copies. Some of you have asked of my notes and the slides, and I've saved them as a PDF and stored them up on the folder. So when you go up on the folder, you can pull down all the slides and the notes that I've used so far. There'll probably be a few things in the notes I didn't mention in class, and vice versa. But just so you know that those are there. Another thing, I don't know what folder this is going to bring. Let me open up a folder. This is our BBC shared is the one that I want.
It's the SharePoint you're referring to.
Yeah, right. I'm going to go ahead and just show you the folder just so you see it. It's going to be, oh, come on, OneDrive. Oh, there we go. Wrong one. Here we go. All right, so yeah, you'll see I put a couple things in there. You have the class notes through module 1, list of slides. And the other reason I wanted to take you to this folder is I've added another chart, and I'll pull this up here in a minute. This is a chart that Dr. Bookman has put together. I have modified it slightly, but nothing really significantly, just to kind of fit a little bit of the format of the modules here. So the first module is really the preliminary events. This is the background information that we covered, Christ's birth, and an episode in his childhood, which we'll talk about here in a minute, as well as the baptism of Jesus and his temptation. At that point, then we will shift next week to start module 2, and we'll be looking at, again, Jesus's public ministry, which takes 2 phases, one in Judea and one in Galilee. So we will be looking at that. So with that, let me go ahead and get started here with our lesson today. And like I said, we will be going back just a little bit to a couple of things we didn't get to last time. So we talked about the genealogies. This is where we left off. And what I'd like to bring up is an episode from Jesus's life, because I think it does give us a little bit of context. And there's an important element here culturally that I want to bring up. And I will say one more thing also about the genealogies of Christ. So when we look at Matthew's genealogy, he talks about bringing everything up in like groups of 14. You know, he's showing both the legal and the physical. I mean, the legal and physical. There's both a legal and a physical line of descendants to King David, which we talked about last time. Matthew presents the legal line, showing that he's the king. Luke presents a physical line. The legal line goes through Solomon, the physical line goes through Nathan, and we showed how that was a brilliant strategy by God to overcome a curse that he put on Jeconiah. But there's another thing that I wanted to point out that Matthew does. Matthew talks about breaking the genealogies up into groups of 14. I'll say like from Abraham to, I'd have to go back and look at it, to like David was 14, and from David to so-and-so was 14, or what have you. And he breaks it down by 14 and by 14. Well, the reality is there's more than 14 generations in there. So we know son can be grandson, great-grandson. It's basically just along the lines of descendants. But there's 2 things I think that are going on there, first off, that I want to share. And that is that it's a memory device. And it's also, I believe, bringing significance to David. So Jews at that time held to or used something called gematria. And that's where they would use numbers and they would associate letters. It's kind of Jewish numerology. Each number had a value in the alphabet. Now, in Hebrew, the first 6 letters of the alphabet I put here, Aleph, Bet, Yamet, Dalet, Hey, Vav. David uses 2 letters because there's no vowels in Hebrew. So we have Dalet, Vav, Dalet, which would be 464, adds up to 14. So when people would hear this emphasis on 14, 14, 14, people would associate that with David. And we do this in our own culture, only not with numerology, with our alphabet. But if I talk about, like, who's number 18? Who comes to mind? Peyton Manning. Yeah. Number 12, Tom Brady, right? We associate names with numbers. Same kind of deal. All right, only theirs is tied to grammar. All right. Talk about that. Now, one thing, let's see. Most of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the birth and early life of Christ, they're all referenced in the Gospel of Matthew, but not Luke, Mark, or John. Why is that? Why do we find all the Old Testament prophecies in Matthew concerning the birth and early life of Christ, but not Matthew, Mark, but not Luke, Mark, or John?
Writing to Jews.
He's writing to Jews, and he's making the point that Jesus is the Messiah, son of David, and how he's the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies for the nation of Israel, for their king. Okay? Now, there's one episode that I want to talk about from Jesus' childhood, and this is when Jesus goes to the temple when he's 12 with their family. So let's go to Luke real quick. Luke chapter, Matthew, Mark, Luke. We're going to go to Luke chapter 2. And Jesus is presented at the temple. Then his parents come and have a visit to Jerusalem. And so we're looking at here in Luke verses 41 and following. And it says, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. And when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning after Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of it, but supposed him to be in the caravan and went a day's journey. And they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when they saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And he said, "Why is it that you are looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my father's house?" Okay, so but they did not understand that statement that he made to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. Okay, so first off, there are festivals that the Jews would go to throughout the year. 3 biggies, and this is one of them. This is the Passover. Who was required to go to the Passover from all of Israel? These feasts where people would go into Jerusalem. Who was required to go? The men, exactly. Wives didn't have to go. Women didn't have to go. So this tells us something about Mary. She values going to the temple and participating in the worship of Yahweh. So it gives us more insight into Mary's spirituality. Now, they I'm going to mention caravans here in a minute because we're going to spend some time looking at that. Now, Jesus was found in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking questions, and he was 12. What do you think might be significant about Jesus being 12? 1 year away from bar mitzvah. Exactly. And so for a year or two before bar mitzvah, Jewish boys would spend time in intense training and diligent training to prepare them to read from the Torah. What they do at their bar mitzvah, it's kind of the culminating event, is they're given the Torah and they read it publicly. And they have to understand it, be able to speak to it, and so forth. So they go through a period of more training. So it would be normal for Jesus to be sitting there getting intention, learning, taking things in from these rabbis. And that's part of how Jewish teachers taught and debated. They would basically throw out topics and argue and debate amongst themselves. And you can hear them. And so Jesus was there, and then he was asking questions and participating, and so forth. So it was so much stunning that someone at Jesus' age and stature would be able to carry on the level of conversation that he had. Not stunning to us, because he obviously did have illumination, and being the Son of God. I don't want to take away from his divinity here. But again, his mind is developing, and he's able to participate there. Now, I want to talk a little bit about caravans, because this is an important topic, and it's something that's going to affect our understanding of what's going to go on here over the next 3.5 years. Travel in in Judea in this time period was not something that was safe to do. You generally just didn't go and you know what, I'm going to go to Santa Fe today, and I'm just going to hop in the car and drive down the road. And we're going to do that by ourselves. Not a safe thing. What you would do, you'd travel in groups. I guess if we were going to go in Chicago and walk down the street at night, we probably want a fire team to go with us, right?
Right.
So that's basically, what was going on here. And so when they're talking about the caravan, that is the way that they travel. They'd meet, and the way that this would work for Passover all the time, we would know, you've heard that it said, that they avoided Samaria. Samaria didn't generally like the Jews coming through their land, particularly for these feasts. Of course, they worshipped up in Mount Gilgal. Gilgal is yeah. Now, they would go in this fashion. They would gather together up in the north, in the Jezreel Valley, up here. They would go through the Harod Valley. This is this diagonal right here, the Harod Valley. They would cross the Jordan. We're south of the Dead Sea. Let me see another picture, and you can see where this is in relation to the Dead Sea. So, not the Dead Sea, the north, this Sea of Galilee. Yeah, here we go, Sea of Galilee. So we're down in here. Here's the Harod Valley. Here's Nazareth over here. So they come south, they go through the valley of Jezreel, they go through the Harod Valley, and then they're going to go down the rift along the Jordan. And it's deep there. It's below sea level. In terms of Nazareth, it's 1,400 feet above sea level. Sea of Galilee, starts at 700 feet below sea level. They get down to the Dead Sea, they're 1,400 feet below sea level. So they're spending a lot of time in the rift, and it can get hot down there. Not a pleasant experience. They're going to want to get out of there. But then they're going to cross the Jordan River, kind of down by Jericho, and then they're going to go. When they do that, they're about 900 feet below sea level. Then they're going to come up to the Mount of Olives, coming into Jerusalem. They're going to come into the Mount of Olives. Now, at the Mount of Olives, they're at basically, Mount of Olives is 2,600 feet, 2,684. Jerusalem's at 2,500 feet. They go up a little bit over the peak and then down. So they basically have gone from, over 1,000 feet below sea level to almost 3,000 feet above, or 2,700 feet above. So it's a big uphill climb. Jericho is one day's journey from Jerusalem. So when they say that the parents or everybody's in Jerusalem and they're going to go one day's journey with the caravan, that means the feast and the festivals are over. They've all got these massive wagons and they're all traveling in large groups with their stuff. And they're going to go, this is about a 4 or 5 day journey, one day across. It's going to put them here at Jericho, just before they cross the Jordan. So they're getting up in the morning. They're like, okay, we're going to cross the Jordan. Where's Jesus? Have you seen Jesus? No, they don't. And so that means the caravan is probably going to move on. Mary and Joseph are going back to Jerusalem. So that kind of gives you a little bit of perspective geography-wise where they're at. We're going to become very familiar with this route because we're going to see it a lot in our study together.
How many miles?
Yeah, it's about between 85 and 90 miles. Last time I looked at it in some detail. I mean, I'll just go, where's the starting point? Where's the ending point? But let's say 90 miles, give or take. One last thing on this section about names. We're going to be seeing names of people during this time period. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Mary, Joseph, Zacharias. And all of these names are common to this region at that time period. So this again adds to the historical veracity and trustworthiness of the Gospels. So scholars and archaeologists do what you would think would be a very boring activity of keeping a list of names whenever they find it in these documents. And they kind of try to date it as much as they can, and they keep geography. So if I were to ask you, what was the most common names in Los Angeles in 1850? Can you give me a list? No. I can't either. But I'll bet they were different than the ones in Denver. And the names that were most common in 1850 in either place are going to be a lot different than the names that are used today. Going back just a couple generations, and we find out we got relatives with names I've never even heard of hardly anymore. So that gives us a way to say, hey, you know what? When we look at the Gospels and we see the names that are recorded, who would have thought that the most common names in the New Testament, the ones that happen over and over again, or just the ones that are there, line up with what the most common names are for Galilee and Judea in the first century? Shocking. But that's also something that's very hard to fake. They didn't have records and things that they could go back and say, you know what, I want to make a book about that time period. And so I want to go, I'm going to go to the library and I'm going to see what kind of names were common then. That wasn't really available. So people are going to make this stuff up. It'd be hard for later, like 100 years later, it'd be hard for them to get it right, which is why I bring it up. All right, so that's lesson 4. Let's move on to John the Baptist. Uh, anyone know who this is? It's not John the Baptist. It's a Caesar. This is Tiberius. This is Tiberius. Tiberius ruled Rome after Augustus dies. He's going to rule from AD 14 to AD 37. And so, pretty much the predominance of Christ's life, right? So, during this time that Jesus is at the temple that we just talked about, Augustus would have still been Caesar, but only for a few more years, maybe 5, 6 years. So now we're going to get into the birth of the forerunner. So this is what we didn't talk about last time because I said we would cover John the Baptist more fully this week. So let's go back to Luke chapter 1. All right. So Luke's narrative regarding the birth of Christ actually begins with announcing the birth of the forerunner. So in the days of Herod, in verse 5, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zacharias of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron. Her name was Elizabeth. They were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both advanced in years. Now it happened that while he was performing his priestly service before God in the appointed order of his division, according to the custom of the priestly office, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were in prayer outside at the hour of the incense offering. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the altar of incense. Zacharias was troubled when he saw the angel, and fear gripped him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zacharias, for your petition has been heard. And your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will give him the name John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord, and he will drink no wine or liquor, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit while yet in his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the sons of Israel back to the Lord their God. It is he who will go as a forerunner before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children, and the disobedient to the attitude of the righteous, so as to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zacharias had a momentary lapse here, and says, "How will I know this for certain?" And he goes, "For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." And I always think about what Zacharias's reaction is with this next statement. The angel answered and said to him, "I am Gabriel." And at that point, I'm thinking, uh-oh, who stands in the presence of God? And I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you shall be silent and unable to speak until the day when these things take place, because you not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their proper time. So Zacharias is going to go outside. He's going to be, and he can't talk, and people are wondering what happened. Now, let me talk a little bit about what has happened here from culture and custom. So he is Zacharias, a priest. He's of the division of Abijah. He was performing the priestly service according to the order of his division, and he was chosen by lot. Now, there were multiple divisions. Uh, Go back, I don't have it in my notes, but I believe there were 24. Um, and so they would serve basically twice a year. And it breaks down according to the tribes and so forth. Well, they're all from Levi. But now, this was not the Day of Atonement. So we all know that there are traditions and customs which are, I think historically reliable, that, about the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and they would tie a rope around his foot in case something happened and he died, they could pull him out, right? But that's not what's going on here. And, even though there's people gathered and all that and watching what's going on, they're not waiting to see if they got to pull the rope on this guy's foot, right? Instead, this is what happens every day at the temple. Um, there is a sequence, a daily routine that takes place, and there's four primary activities that go on. Two before the temple gates were opened in the morning, and two after the temple gates. Two before and two after they were opened. Now, the first lot, and each of these was chosen by lot. So the priests would line up and they would cast lots. And based on how the lots were cast, like, okay, you get task 1, you get task 2, you get task 3, you get task 4. So lot 1 goes to who's going to go in and clean and sweep off the altar and prepare it and start the fire on the altar. Because if you're going to have a sacrifice on the altar, you got to have a fire. They go out and clean off all the ashes, whatever, get it ready, and prep it. The second lot would be for who's going to slay the animal for the sacrifice, sprinkle the blood on the altar, and then trim the golden candlestick in the holy place and make the incense altar ready. Now, the third lot, this is the big one, would go into the holy place, not the Holy of Holies, but the holy place outside the Holy of Holies, and offer the incense offering on the incense altar, symbolizing the prayers of Israel being presented and lifting up before God. Which is interesting. What does Gabriel say to Zacharias? Your prayers have been answered. So, this is the big one. Who gets to go and offer the prayers? It was a once in a lifetime privilege. So once Zacharias was chosen by Lot to do this, he could never participate in the third lot again. He continued to serve in the temple and when his time came around, but he could never have this lot come to him again. And so it was a huge privilege. And then the fourth lot would be who's going to go ahead and take the parts of the sacrifice and actually offer them and burn them on the altar. So Zacharias gets the third lot. He's going to go in and he's going to offer incense. And so that's kind of the context of what's going on. Any questions on that? Okay. Yeah.
Chronicles 24:10 said the eighth lot of Elijah.
The what's that? Say that one again. That the what?
24:10 said the eighth lot goes to Elijah. That's Zacharias, the division of Elijah.
Okay, so he was the eighth division of the 24. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Got it. Okay. Got it. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about what he says. Because Gabriel is announcing the Baptist's birth, and John is said to be the forerunner in 1:17. It is he who will go as a forerunner before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children and the disobedient to the attitude of righteousness, so as to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Now, this relates to the prophecy given in Malachi 4, 5, and 6. I won't turn there today, but you can write that down. That is where that's given. And after the transfiguration, so now we have a couple of issues. What is John the Baptist's role in terms of being the forerunner? Um, you know, at the transfiguration, Jesus' disciples ask him about Elijah coming first. They see Jesus, they see the Christ, and they go, okay, I get it. You're the Messiah. I see your glory. Peter, James, and John up there on the Mount of Transfiguration. Well, what about Elijah? Elijah was supposed to come first. And Jesus tells them in Matthew, and I'll turn there, Matthew 17, that John the Baptist is the Elijah who was to come. Matthew 17. And we're going to be in verse 9 to 13. So they're up on the Mountain of Transfiguration. That's not 17. How did I get to Matthew 9? I could have been certain. I typed 17 in there. All right. Yep. So his disciples said to him, why then do the scribes say Elijah must come first? Verse 11, and he answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah already came, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. So Jesus says, John the Baptist. But now we got another issue. Because we come to John, the Gospel of John. Look at John chapter 1 here. And we see about John baptizing people, and the scribes and the Pharisees and so forth come to him. Yeah, how did I can fix that? It helps when I keep my tabs in order. But okay. Yep. John 1, and I'm going to look at verse 21. And so they're asking him now. Some from the Pharisees had come to John, and they're asking, that's verse 24. I'm going to go backwards. Verse 19, this is a testimony of John when Jews were sent to him from the priests. So a group of Jews, which we'll talk about next week, come and they start talking about to John, see what's going on here at the river of the Jordan. Priests and Levites from Jerusalem ask him, what are you doing? Who are you? And he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ. They asked him, what then? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Well, Jesus said that he's Elijah, and John says, I'm not Elijah. So who was right? Well, they're both right. And so how do we put this together? And the way we put this together is this way. So the key to understanding this is remembering how Gabriel described John the Baptist. John the Baptist, or Gabriel never said that John the Baptist was going to be Elijah. There's no reincarnation here. Instead, he says John comes in the spirit and the power of Elijah. And so what we see here in the picture in the Old Testament and the prophecy in Malachi about the forerunner. Now, there's a literal Elijah in the future coming back since he didn't die, perhaps. I'm not sure. But in this case, we're talking about someone who came in the spirit and the power of Elijah. And Jesus is saying and referencing that. So in that sense, Elijah is, or John the Baptist is the Elijah who was to come because John the Baptist came in his spirit and his power. Now, this is figurative in the sense that Elijah's spirit didn't just, come into John in some way at his birth or in conception. No. But, and I'll explain this in a minute in the Old Testament, because there's an example that explains this. But all that to say, John could say, I'm not Elijah. Elijah went up to heaven hundreds of years ago, but he did come in spirit and power. So Jesus could say, this is who we were talking about, at least for my first coming. So let's go to the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is going to help make this clear. So we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings 19. And we're going to go a little bit and have some fun in the Old Testament. And we're going to look at verses 15 to 16. God is speaking to Elijah. This is when Elijah ran off and hid in a cave. And God comes to him, verse 13. What are you doing here, Elijah? In verse 15, the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you have arrived, he's going to list three things for him to do. You shall anoint Hazael, king over Aram, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, you shall appoint as prophet in your place. It shall come about that the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death, and so on and so on. But those were the three things. Appoint Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. Now, how many of those things did Elijah do? One. He appointed Elisha. Now, when Elijah goes and sees Elijah to be taken up, he's not going to leave him that day. We can we continue on here, verse 19. So he departs, Elijah from talking to God. He finds Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who he's plowing, and before him, he passes over him, threw his mantle on him. So basically, he's anointing him to be prophet in his place. Now we go to 2 Kings chapter 2, and we're going to see that Elijah is taken up, and Elisha has a request. And that's like, Elijah goes, what shall I do for you? And Elisha says, give me a double portion of your spirit, of the spirit of God that's enabling and empowering you. Let me have a double portion of that. And Elijah says, what you're asking is really hard here, but if you see me when I'm taken up, it'll be done for you. And Elijah saw him. And so immediately after Elijah is taken up, we start seeing Elijah doing the same kinds of things that Elijah did, splitting the Jordan, the river, walking across, and so forth. And then Elisha does the two things that God told Elijah to do. He anoints Hazael, he appoints Jehu. So Elisha fulfilled the ministry of Elijah. And it's not Elijah's fault. God took him up to heaven. So we have that. Someone operating in Elijah's power to do things for Elijah, or that Elijah was tasked to do. So I would see a parallel between how Elisha fulfilled Elijah's ministry and task in his spirit and power, same way that John the Baptist did. Right? Did that make sense? Okay, good. All right. So now we're going to get into the ministry of John the Baptist. And so we'll go back to Luke. We'll look at Luke chapter 2. Actually, yeah. I want Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3, verse 1. All right. Now, in Luke chapter 3, starting in verse 1, Luke tells us, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene, and the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. Now we'll just stop right there. Look at all of the things that Luke gives us that's going on in history. This is the most historically attested verse in the scriptures. I mean, we got Tiberius's reign, we got Pontius Pilate, we got Herod, we have Philip, we have all of these things that can tell us and pinpoint when was a time period when all these things occurred and overlapped. And so it's very important. Luke wants us to know when this happened. So after years of poor health, Caesar Augustus died on August 19th in AD 14 at the age of 75. He is immediately succeeded by his adopted stepson Tiberius. 14 plus 15 would put us at AD 29. It turns out it's that simple, but it's actually sophisticated. I mean, you got all kinds of things about when was the ascension year and the regional year and how they did all these things and they counted time, because sometimes someone's reign didn't start on the day they started. They could go forward or backward, so on. Sometimes people's reigns overlapped. I've done all that work in the past, and I've got a presentation on it if you want more details, and I can point you to some places to go, but I'll just give you the short of it here. John's ministry started in AD 29. Now, I'm giving you the date, but like I said, you don't have to accept it. I got data, and I can show you where you can go do your own research if you'd like. Okay, now Luke's data also tells us a lot about information about overall political and the religious environment as well. So we're going to do a little excursus here into Roman history. There's a theme I want to develop kind of going on in the background that's going to have a very significant impact on the week that Christ surrenders his life on the cross. So again, Tiberius is Caesar. He reigns from AD 14 to 37. Now, in AD 14, something else happens because that's the year that a man named Sejanus becomes the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, which essentially at that time, Augustus had set it up, the imperial bodyguard. So very trusted, obviously in the emperor's inner circle. But under Sejanus, because this is when Augustus is going to die, the Praetorian Guard effectively becomes the civil and administrative center of the Roman Empire and the whole governmental operation. So as a result, Sejanus becomes very, very powerful. Now in AD 26, Caesar Tiberius, who's been in Rome, decides to withdraw and live on the Isle of Capri. He's going to have just kind of an imperial resort palace, and he's just going to rest and relax. Sejanus has it all under control in Rome, and so that's how he takes it about. By AD 29, when John the Baptist ministry starts, Tiberius is a totally absent emperor. He's basically just living the life on Capri, and Sejanus is just like co-emperor almost. Now, one more thing happens in AD 20. Well, I got a couple more things I got to tell you about Sejanus. First off, he hated the Jews vehemently, and the Jews knew it. Jews from Rome all the way to Judea knew Sejanus hated them. And they knew about the intensity of that. Sejanus is Roman, yes. Well, what else happened then? We get to AD 26. Pontius Pilate becomes prefect over Judea. So that was a post that Pontius Pilate would hold from AD 26 to 36. Now, prefects generally, at this point, at least in these territorial prefects, governed for about 10 years. Nero's son Archelaus was ethnarch of Judea until 86. In 86, Augustus had had enough and basically replaced him. And then the first few prefects, had some issues until they got a couple that could go and have more standard tenures. And so that's where we get to Pontius Pilate, the second of those with kind of a standard tenure. Now, why am I mentioning Pilate now? Because it was Sejanus who had to have appointed him. He was over the Praetorian Guard. Pontius Pilate would have come from like an equestrian family. Probably maybe even participated in the Praetorian Guard at some level. And Sejanus was in authority, and Pilate also had anti-Semitic sentiments, hated the Jews, and so he was very willing to go to Judea and implement Sejanus's policies, which puts and historically, Pilate's had a couple of missteps with some things that aren't recorded in the scriptures. And so Pilate's going to have a rough time with the Jews in Judea because of this Sejanus connection. So in one sense, there's probably some kind of friendly relationship between Pilate and Sejanus. There's one more thing. Because of Pilate's friendships and position, just like today, you don't become an ambassador unless you know somebody. He's going to become governor or prefect of Judea. He's going to have close ties to the right people. And as a result of that, and Sejanus is one of those for sure, he becomes a friend of Caesar. Remember that phrase, a friend of Caesar. We're going to hear that again. A very crucial moment. And as a result of that, he was also given a ring to be worn to signify the relationship, kind of a fellowship of the ring idea. So you could tell he's got the ring. He's part of the Caesar's inner circle. He's buds with Tiberius. Okay. Now back to Luke 2. And I'm going to say, I'll say it right here because we're getting about halfway through lesson 5 here. We'll pick up on that next week to finish this and continue. I'll talk a little bit here more to finish this point. I know I'm pushing the clock a little bit, trying to get a lot in here. Sometimes it'll go a little faster. Sometimes it'll go a little slower. It is a little bit artificial, but also I want to make sure that we're emphasizing the main points each week as we go, because, we can sit here and talk about a lot of these things for hours, right? Because there's just so much thing that happened in the culture and the context. I think we'll all be blessed as well if we didn't make this like a 5-year class. So, to that end, back to Luke 2, because there's a couple more things. Luke 3. No, Luke 3. I gotta edit my notes. It's chapter 3. Luke put his genealogy in a weird place. Okay. Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So I stand condemned. All right. Luke Luke chapter 3 mentions that there were two high priests, Annas and Caiaphas. Now, how many high priests served in the temple at any one time? One. So why were there two? Well, the thing is the high priest served under the kind of the auspices of Rome. He had to have Rome's blessing. And the prefect just before Pilate, about AD 15, 16, was Valerius Gratus. Annas had been the high priest since Archelaus in AD 6 to 15. But then when Valerius Gratus came in, he said, "No, we're done with you, Annas." Now, the Jewish people still are going to look to Annas, like, hey, we don't care what the Rome says. But they went through a process looking at Annas' sons and things and tried them out. None of them really kind of passed the mustard. They're all corrupt, whatever. Finally, they land on Caiaphas, who's Annas' son-in-law. So it's still family. And that's why we're going to see some close connections between Annas and Caiaphas in the Passion Week and other places. So even though Caius is officially the high priest, blessed by Rome, and Annas is still around, in some sense, we may see examples of this in our own country, where we have a political leader, but we're not really sure who's behind the scenes, kind of.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. This isn't the first
yeah,
time.
right. I don't want to be any more specific than that, but hypothetically, so it might kind of be like that. And so we'll stop here, and I will stop the stream, and then we'll close in prayer.